Itorah is a more than capable 2D action platformer by Grimbart Tales that embraces an Aztec-style aesthetic, Metroidvania-inspired level design without being a Metroidvania, and some really good wow moments that really show off the care that went into it. Overall, I enjoy my time with Itorah, though I would like to take a look at both the positives and negatives I encountered with the 8 hours I spent to beat this title. As usual, there will be timestamps below if you want to know more about a specific aspect of the game, but for those of you that want the whole picture, let's dive on in. From the beginning, the story adopts the flashback model for most of its key storytelling, with most of the major story beats being related to our character's history and the history of our fateful, sentient acts. This is interwoven with the needs of the inhabitants of the current world and their struggle against the corruption, which is your main motivating force and source of directionality. For the most part, they do work well together, though at times I found myself more interested in the world story than necessarily the stories of the individuals we were helping, since only a couple had more than a few lines of dialogue, much less more complex cutscenes. It was hard to get as attached. That said, as a whole, the story is competent. There were a few moving moments and enough to keep the yarn going, but not quite enough to have me thinking too deeply about it during or after the story ended. But it was enjoyable and felt like it reached a fairly satisfying conclusion given the scope of the game. As far as the scope of the game goes, the gameplay was, well, enjoyable, with most of the controls feeling fairly responsive, navigating the world being fairly straightforward thanks to a well-marked map especially, and relatively easy to recognize landmark rooms to navigate by otherwise. In terms of that navigation, getting lost was never an issue for me since the game is fairly linear. Despite having dungeon design reminiscent of a Metroidvania, it's not one, other than the fact that you have to transition certain areas such as the town multiple times to reach each consecutive dungeon. Progress through these dungeons followed a specific pattern. Enter dungeon, learn the core mechanic, get a movement or attack skill or both, and engage in chase sequences, and then finally fight a boss with their own special mechanics, then proceed to town. I think my only real complaint with the actual gameplay, other than the fact that I really do not like chase sequences, but that's a personal thing, is that your specific attack skill animation, the throwing skill, had way too long of an animation lock whenever it comes to catching your axe, basically meaning that in a lot of circumstances, it could easily result in you taking unnecessary damage while you are stuck in place for over half of a second twirling it. This became especially frustrating against the final boss, who had much more aggressive and even chaotic attack patterns, meaning standing still for the amount of time required to catch the axe was, well, painful. But beyond that, it was a lot of fun, and the normal movement, dodge rolls, and yes, even the melee combat skills felt very responsive and enjoyable. This also assured that the platforming, other than a couple eaten inputs, which I think may have been my controller, was smooth and enjoyable throughout most of the game, especially whenever you could chain different movement techniques together. And you will need to learn to do this to complete the game, though none of the challenges presented felt terribly unreasonable, and I think if I did a subsequent playthrough, I could easily traverse most of these areas in far less time and even still get most of the upgrade items. Moving on from the gameplay, we have graphics and sound. Graphically speaking, as you could already tell by now, the game is very well crafted, with easy-to-read character models, beautiful environments, and enemies that range from mundane to weirdly intricate, and even the bosses adopting varying levels of complexity. The sound design, while less in your face, was equally enjoyable, with good combat and environmental sounds, as well as nice music that sits immersively in the background most of the time, only stepping forward whenever you need it for a given wow moment, such as this early moment whenever you get treated to not only beautiful silhouettes, but also a distinctly atmospheric musical track. So yeah, really enjoyable to take in. Outside of a short lightning section later on that kind of messed with my eyes, there wasn't really a single area that disappointed me. So overall, my experience with the game was a positive one, and in spite of the small gripes, the game itself is totally worth trying out if you're looking for an enjoyable 6 to 10 hours of just fun platforming with a pinch of combat. I would hope that maybe with their next game, we could see them tackle a full-blown Metroidvania with the same level of care they put into this game. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members and patrons for their continued support, as well as the publisher for providing a key for coverage. And if there are any special games you would like to see reviewed, new or old, mention them down below.